today, really, I'm just going to be giving the lead off to introduce the discussion on the Black Lives Matter movement and where next for the movement. And really, we all saw this summer how the Black Lives Matter movement kind of reignited after the murder of George Floyd. We saw millions of people in the US and the UK and across the world kind of take to the streets to try and fight against racism and police violence. And the protests over the last several months have really drawn attention to the problems of racism and police violence. But the protests really hit a kind of peak around the time of the toppling of the Edward Colston statue. And really since then, there hasn't really been much from the movement. And really it's now the question is kind of how can we turn all this energy that we saw over summer, how can we turn that energy into an effective action? And what we kind of saw as well over summer was a lot of PR departments racing to tell the world that they believe that Black Lives Matter, with a lot of empty gestures and like just token gestures. But really a lot of these gestures backfired when employees described their own experiences of racism at these companies. And never mind the fact that a lot of these companies still continue to profit from the imperialistic economic exploitation of Black people across Africa and around the world. From the Tory government, we saw attempts to kind of quell the protest by launching another inquiry into racial inequality. But they got this latest one set up by Munira Mirza, who doesn't actually believe in institutional racism and has actually criticised what she believes is a culture of grievance. And the Tory government have also been deliberately attempting to divert attention away from the real issues of police brutality and racism. Instead, they've been stoking fears about refugees coming to Dover, and the BBC and other capitalist media have supported this kind of rhetoric, and they've created a hysteria around cancel culture. But it was clear from the demonstrations that not a single protester called for BBC proms to stop the singing of Rule Britannia or any of these other kind of bold kind of claims. And recently, Labour announced that Keir Starmer had passed his racial sensitivity training, whatever that means. And so far, rather than promote the aims of the movement, the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, is really he's called them nonsense, which is something that even got Nigel Farage's agreement. And this is all kind of many months since the Labour leaks revealed that racism was a huge problem within Labour Party officials, where there were quite racist messages about Diane Abbott. But still the party hasn't done anything of substance in response to that. But it all seems to be aligned with Keir Starmer's aims to reverse the changes made under Corbyn and attract right-wingers by making symbolic appeals to nationalism and other right-wing values. And while Starmer's lack of support against racism is bad, his lack of support against police brutality has been even worse. Recently, he's whipped Labour MPs to abstain against bills that have legalised spy cops or troops committing crimes such as murder, torture and sexual violence. And really we've seen, both in America and in the UK, Liberals have really reached the limits of their ability to respond to the movement, and all they've really been able to offer is a lot of empty gestures. And really, what we need to see from the movement is a step up in the intensity of it. After the murder of Jacob Blake later this summer, We kind of saw sports athletes and teams in America organize wildcat strikes. And this was a huge step forward in the right direction and a significant opportunity for the BLM movement to increase its strength. Only a single day of action had billionaire owners of the NBA scrambling to the negotiating table to try and hear the demands of players. But Obama, understanding the true meaning of class solidarity, Obama stepped in to try and dissuade the players from further striking so that he could save his billionaire friends from the threat of an organized striking workforce. But that being said, this battle needs to be continued. The BLM movement needs to move past kind of basic demonstrations and just raising awareness, and really it needs to use the tools that are available to workers. While protests and boycotts can be ignored, the economic impact of a strike can force the ruling class to really make the changes that have been demanded. And really, Obama didn't just only stop the movement or slow down the movement at its peak, but he also got the weakest concessions imaginable. The only kind of concession that the athletes were able to get from the NBA was the formation of a social justice coalition and the turning of all basketball arenas into voting locations, which is really nothing. And it feeds the narrative that this is a Republican versus Democrat issue, as if Black Lives Matter didn't start under Obama's regime, and it didn't start with murders happening in Democrat-governed cities. And really, at the moment, it seems like the BLM movement lacks any real direction or organized movement to try and pressurize the Democratic Party or the government here. And while it's seen a huge number of teenagers organizing demonstrations and lots of small new groups forming in cities in the US and around the world, there's really a need for a democratic organization to try and channel the movement's energy into effective action. And unfortunately, as it stands, a lot of celebrities and individuals have claimed to represent the movement, but have done nothing really but get themselves promotions and opportunities, while the suffering and the problems remain. And I think it's important at this point as well to review the demands of the movement. So going back to the start of the movement really in 2012 and 2013, besides demanding justice for the victims of police violence, the movement also had demands to prevent police brutality. And the smallest of these demands has really been like sensitivity training and de-escalation training. But we've also got to seriously ask whether an organization that's been shown to be institutionally racist and violent, and whether that could be reformed through these kind of individual training programs. And can you really reform the mentality of a British police officer who feels confident taking selfies with the bodies of murdered Black sisters and posting it to a forum? Similarly, historically, another policy has been for the mandatory use of body cams. And the logic behind this being that by forcing the police to wear cameras, it will make them think twice before causing harm. However, and also the other kind of idea behind it is that if they do cause harm or do some kind of evil, then there's evidence for them to be punished. But as we've seen in both America and here, body cams are accidentally switched off and then the footage is lost. And when there is video evidence of these kind of injustices, then the rest of the criminal justice system kind of reveals itself as corrupt as it is. We saw Wretch 32's 60-year-old dad getting tasered going down the stairs in his own home. And this was recorded by the police, but there was no justice. And while both of these demands improvements, it's not enough that the crimes of the police are recorded. What really matters is if the victims and the communities have the power to hold the police accountable for their actions. Body cameras are only really as effective as the accountability process. And this is why some of the more recent calls for reform have been demands to bring the police under democratic community ownership. The Socialist Party actually has long supported the policy for democratic control. Back in 1981, we raised demands for democratic control by local government police committees, and these were meant to be elected bodies involving the working class through representation from trade unions, community organisations, and so on. And really, we demanded that elected police committees should have the power to appoint and dismiss chief constables and senior officers, and that these committees would be responsible for day-to-day policing policies. And this would include weeding out racist elements or fascist sympathisers within the police, and also having genuine oversight over complaint procedures and being able to investigate problematic branches. And the Black and Asian Caucus has listed a lot of these demands in the Charter, which we'll be reviewing in a few weeks' time. And while a lot of these changes would do a lot to change the police culture and operations, there are still a lot of issues. The war on drugs, the war on terrorism, the war on crime, these still continue to be fought on a class of people that are perpetually labelled as criminals, mainly the poor, the young, the Muslim, and the darker skinned. A guy called Alex Vitale, he wrote a book on the end of policing, and he said a kinder, gentler, and more diverse war on the poor is still a war on the poor. And so because of that, we need to not just look at changing the culture in policing, but also discuss what the scope of policing should be and what the overall strategy of stopping crimes could be in a socialist world. And we saw during a lot of the demonstrations this year calls to defund the police. And while we don't use that slogan because it can be easily misunderstood, we do recognise that a lot of the scope of policing, could be handled better by diverting resources towards other forms of social welfare. The NHS needs to be empowered so that it can prevent the harms of drug use, and the successes of legalisation in Portugal and other places should be considered, although I know the Socialist Party doesn't have an official position on this. And council housing should be the state's response to homelessness rather than police and the criminal justice system. Similarly, well-paid, secure jobs should be the answers to growing crime and growing issues like that. And so far, I've really only mentioned things that could be decriminalised or legalised to varying extents, but a lot of crimes are still crimes, and but a lot more should be done to prevent these crimes beyond punishment. So, like, while fraud pays better than the minimum wage, you can't really be surprised that teenagers are going to use it as a way to make money. And while people can't find well-paid jobs, you can't be surprised that people are stealing. Similarly, capitalist alienation is a key driver for sending people towards terrorism, and communities should be supported so that they can deal with the alienation of their youth and the mental health issues which lead to a lot of issues like terrorism. And as well as defunding the police, the abolishment of the prisons has also been brought up in discussions, and it's kind of viewed as a long-term goal following several radical changes to the restorative, to implement a kind of restorative justice system. And I'd be happy to hear people's thoughts on that goal and that kind of demand that's been raised at these demonstrations. And really, I've only focused on police brutality so far because that's what's triggered these demonstrations. But it's important also to discuss racism too. The Liberal response to these demonstrations is focused on unconscious bias training and calls for better representation of ethnic minorities in media, politics, and business. And while these changes can help reduce the effects of structural racism and give opportunities to a lot of Black individuals, it does nothing to really challenge the roots of racism. In Carla's latest book, he talks about a study that showed kind of the current definition of whiteness and the current structures of racism were only really properly defined in like the late 1600s, when African and European bond servants, which were basically slaves, they rebelled against the British rule in the US. And the British ruling elite back then used race to try and divide the workers, giving the white people certain rights and taking rights away from Black people, such as taking away the rights of Black people to own white slaves or have children with a white woman. And really, you see that same tactic of divide and rule used by the capitalist class today. You see Nigel Farage whipping up fear about refugees to try and distract from the greater issues of child poverty in the UK and over such issues. Similarly, Donald Trump claims China and Mexicans are taking away jobs rather than greedy bosses and corporations. And similarly, when Nigel Farage and others get on TV and they talk about migrants coming on dinghies, they're really and coming to destroy the NHS. Really, they're taking away the blame from their tax dodging friends. And really, all of these and all of the unconscious bias training and other liberal approaches to anti-racism does nothing to tackle the lies, these kind of lies, or fix these core issues. Malcolm X said you can't have capitalism without racism, because him and others recognize that racism is used by the capitalists as a tool to divide workers. And since the civil rights movement, it's kind of appeared that Black people have been slowly, racism against Black people has been slowly eroded. And seeing so many people out on these kind of demonstrations, it's easy to be lulled into a false sense of security about the direction of racism. And when things get, but the problem is that when things get economically worse, the racism that looks like it was defeated can suddenly appear again. At various points throughout history, you've seen that you've seen such people such as like the Jewish community in Europe face huge amounts of anti-Semitism for periods, but also have periods where they're not facing as much anti-Semitism. And if we look at the Jewish community as well, there have been cases where they've had a lot of the things that a lot of Black people think Black people need in order to fight racism, in terms of having a thriving middle class, or Black-owned businesses, or political and business leaders. But they have these things now, and they've had many of them back in the early 1900s. But that didn't stop fascist groups from attacking Jewish people in the Battle of Cable Street. In fact, it was an anti-fascist collection of socialists and local people that supported them against the fascists. And when Germany was in the midst of a huge economic recession, it was a German elite that supported Hitler to turn the anger of the German workers against Jewish people, so that that anger wouldn't be turned towards socialist answers to their economic problems. At the moment, we're kind of sat waiting for probably one of the greatest economic recessions in a century. And if we don't stop capitalism, then racism against Black people will take this same cyclical pattern that racism against Jewish people has taken. And while the times are good, we've been able to make slow gains, but when the economy crashes again, then it will be migrants that will be blamed for poverty, and it will be ethnic minorities that will be blamed for taking jobs and benefits away from rich white people. Racism can't be stopped by sensitivity training while the newspapers are telling you that we need to bomb democracy into brown people. And at the same time, saying that refugees come into our country. And at the same time, they're saying that, refugees are coming to our country, and that's why you can't afford a house. That's why we need international solidarity in social housing and an end to imperialist wars to try and end racism. Similarly, racism can't really be stopped by black-owned businesses or any of these other kind of policies. If the TV is telling white people that, you know, the reason why they've lost their job and can't pay their mortgage is because your Nigerian neighbor stole your job. And this is why we need jobs guarantee, we need to be looking at universal basic income. And it's a reason why we need democratic workers' control of the biggest corporations. Overall, just to finish off, I'd say that like, the spontaneous protests of this summer were really a sign of the energy and the actual potential in the BLM movement. And it showed that there's a mass support for a fight against racism and police brutality. However, to actually get substantive change, students, young workers, trade unions, and all workers need to organise both at work, school, and universities, and within a democratic party to try and push the demands of the movement and get real change. Thank you. For policing jobs, and it's clear that like the police have gone into overdrive trying to get more ethnic minorities and women recruited onto the force. But I think the consciousness of black people has gone beyond just accepting more black police or having some kind of like ethnic minority divisions or whatever within the police, because we've experienced black leaders and black police who reinforce the kind of systematic problems that they're trying to fight. So I don't think people are just going to accept having black police, because especially within the police, like people know that the police as an institution isn't it's not about having more black policemen, it's about what their function within communities and how they basically attack the working class in many ways. And on the question about whether cheers. On the question of whether the BLM movement is kind of it's similar to the Yellow Vest movement, where they're lacking that kind of proper class orientation. Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting. So, like the women who started the BLM movement, they describe themselves as like Marxists, like trained Marxists. But I think the movement itself has lacked any kind of real integration with like the trade union movement or organising as a workers' force in any real way. And really, it's just been picked up by any celebrity and any kind of black person who's trying to be a politician is just taking the movement and trying to get what they can out of it. But there really is a lack of organisation and a lack of kind of a connection to the rest of like working class organisations. O'Sheen kind of raised the point on how sports is really one of the few areas where like the poorest working class people have been able to kind of rise to a position of prominence and position of almost power, and been able to use that power, and it's been really shown by the BLM movement this summer with the strikes happening, and it's also like historically as well, you've seen sports as kind of where people like Muhammad Ali coming out and really showing solidarity with these kind of movements, and I think it is definitely an area where it will continue. Ronnie really raised a lot of points on kind of the history of black people outside of Africa within the Americas, and the history of racism and slavery in the Americas. And it's something that isn't really discussed as much, kind of the history of slavery in the Caribbean and Latin America. People don't really recognize that Brazil has like the largest population of black people outside of Africa, because when people think of Brazilians, you think of more lighter skinned people than black people. And we also don't really learn about the history of places like Haiti and Toussaint-Louverture, where he kind of led a slave revolution to take back, get rid of like French slavers and take control of the island of Haiti. And these aspects of history and revolutionary history within Africa and America and Black history are really ignored. I guess on the issue of defunding the police as well, and just kind of going back on that point actually, and also the point about the Royal Ulster Constabulary, there really is a strong connection between imperialism, colonialism, and policing, racism, and that's why racism has its kind of that's why policing has its racist kind of undertones and its racist aspects, because it's at the core root of it all. While the police in the UK aren't as brutal visibly as the American ones, you see a lot more of the brutality take place at our borders when people are getting deported, when people are in migration centres. That's kind of where you see the boot of the state. Just quickly going back on Tom's points about Tom's points about environmental issues and racism. I think a lot of really good points have been raised on that as well. And also you mentioned about kind of the marketization of like the criminal justice system, and we all see kind of footballers and millionaires getting away with things like drunk driving and other crimes with just a slap on the wrist, because it's not a question of whether you're guilty or not, it's a question of whether you can afford lawyers who can make it seem like you're not guilty. And also on the kind of points of environmental issues that both Ronnie, Mark and Tom also raised, it's really the global south that's had its resources exploited and its nature destroyed to sustain capitalism, and it's Black and Asian people who've had their fishing water destroyed by pollution. And I think there were some really key points raised at the end there about how under climate change, like the right wing's response has been to say, let's batten down the hatches. We might cause all the pollution, but we're not going to let anyone. We're going to make it as hard as possible for people to flee from the damage of climate change, and that is a real threat of kind of more authoritarian fascist response to climate change, rather than the needed response of socialist and solidarity. Mark also asked a lot of questions about the difference between the working class and the bourgeoisie, and I think that those questions got answered really well. I think this as well, it's important to highlight that my auntie, she lives in Peckham. She's got her own she's running her own business, trying to sell fabrics and stuff like that. But it doesn't really compare to the real business owners and the real people that control capital in our society. She's a lot more closer to those everyday workers and the Richard Bransons of the world. Also, I think the questions on how socialism is the answer to racism and climate change got answered really quite well, and I think it's kind of in two parts really, that it's getting to the roots of racism, which is kind of whipped up by capitalist media and politicians to try and turn the anger of workers away from real issues and turn it towards blaming migrants for joblessness, for low wages, and for the crumbling infrastructure that we see around us. And those issues will remain under capitalism because they have no incentive to fix those issues. And really, under socialism, you will be focused on solving the economic conditions that kind of spread racism, because, you know, when people see like their local shops failing, and people see that, you know, just a crumbling world around them, then of course they're going to be driven towards more right-wing answers towards those problems. But also we shouldn't support to differentiate ourselves from the kind of liberals, where the focus is on a kind of like self-flagellization, where it's like, oh, you know, like focus on white guilt and such, but really it should be a focus on solidarity and actually fighting for justice for others. And this isn't to say, like others have said, you know, like racism won't end the day that we institute socialism, and it won't really, it won't end that day, but it takes like a committed approach to continuously trying to get rid of ending racism. And you can't really make a dent in those kind of ingrained forms of racism until you get rid of the parts that's spreading racism and the parts that are generating these other forms of hatred. And I guess I'll finish on some of Martin Luther King's words. He said, "We must recognize that we can't solve our problems now until there's a radical redistribution of economic and political power. And this means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. And you can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the other. And the whole structure of American life must be changed." Thank you.